All right, APHUG, going to run you through some video notes here, and we'll get ourselves to a little magic place where we'll then finish off the rest in class. So we finish her off here getting introduced to, again, globalization, but just seen through yet a different perspective. Get used to that. We are used to it because we've already been doing it with other units, and we will see that as we go through our last unit. So we started in there just kind of talking about um, kind of what you see there for A, and again, big picture, just smaller world due to those technology improvements. Globalization. So when we talk about this challenge to state sovereignty, um, think back in unit 3 when we were learning about how some cultural diffusion sometimes is seen as negative. Like American culture, which is very influential, and that some countries are fearful of that it's going to, it will overshadow their own culture because they might have more of their kids want, if they think American culture is cool, they want to, they want to copy that, they want to be like that, and they fear that their culture just poof, somewhere in the middle of all that goes away. And so it's kind of the same idea here when we talk about state sovereignty and just kind of the security that a country feels of its own, its own government, its own ability to think about the word sovereignty. Where you control your territory, it's yours. So we'll talk about some ways that has been impacted. Uh, my first example here is the role of technology. Okay. And, again, I always keep talking about tech and transportation, communications and transportation, that's a key part of globalization. And one of the early examples, this is going back to 2010, that we saw where technology could really end up playing a role um, when it comes to state government, state sovereignty, was what a series of revolts that broke out in North Africa and the Middle East, which collectively they called the Arab Spring revolts. Just because of the kind of time of year a lot of this started going on, but started in Tunisia, northern Africa, and then spread beyond there to the Middle East. And what set these revolts apart from anything before it is that most of the communication between the, especially mainly younger people who were rising up against governments that they didn't believe were respecting their rights, things like that. But it was organized by smartphone, and that really made the world kind of stand up and take notice. A lot of the revolts were not 100% successful. Some of them saw some short-term gains, but then things slowly kind of evolved, kind of devolved back down. But the organizing, the planning of these revolts was done by young people coordinating on their cell phones, on their smartphones. And so that is a clear example of how an advance in technology challenged government of different countries. And that gets us right into that concept of the state sovereignty. Challenge the sovereignty of those governments, for sure. Their own people challenging it, by the way. All right. Okay. What another fun word for us to throw into the mix: supranationalism. All right. I think we're going to look at look at this in some different ways. But so there's your definition right there. Okay. And so this is when we see different countries that band together and work for some kind of common good. And we will give you a bunch of examples, of course. Probably the biggest example we have is the United Nations. The UN was created in the kind of the last months of World War II back in 1945, and was an attempt to try to come up with an organization to avoid World War III. I mean, in effect, the United Nations has grander goals. They try to stop conflicts and wars. If you pay a lot of attention to the news, obviously, mixed results on that, being we constantly have wars and conflicts going on in different parts of the world. But could be argued that things could be worse without the United Nations because it gives basically a seat to representatives from every country in the world, and when there's problems, the hope is that they will come to the United Nations and they can talk out resolutions rather than immediately going to mobilizing their militaries and getting ready to go and fight. Um, like I said, the United Nations doesn't have a perfect record by any stretch. But at the same time, there have been a lot of conflicts that have been resolved through the other works of the United Nations. So the United Nations, a big prime example of supranationalism in action. All right. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO. NATO is an organization that I think is up to 32 countries now. This one also created at the end of World War II. And this was created when the United States and some of our close allies, especially a lot of Western European countries, began to recognize the threat that the Soviet Union was beginning to represent right there at the tail end and right at the end of World War II, when it became clear that the Soviet Union wasn't going to keep its word about giving freedom to the Eastern European countries it had freed from the Nazis, instead turning them into satellite states and using them as that buffer we were talking about the other day, kind of putting them in that kind of shadow belt kind of situation. NATO was formed as a counter to this growing, what we saw as a threat from the Soviet Union, and started out relatively small. It was just a handful of countries. We were charter members, France, Britain, again, a bunch of those Western European countries. But now it's up to 31. It's one of the sticking points with the war between Russia and Ukraine, because Ukraine wants to join NATO, and Russia, when they have offered peace, they've always made that conditional that Ukraine doesn't join NATO. Ukraine would like to join NATO because if you belong to them, in effect, an attack on any member of NATO is considered to be an attack on all. Okay, and so it's like telling the world, I've got 30 buddies, and they've got my back if you ever come at me with with anything, and if you attack me, you're not going to just be seeing me attack back. You're going to be seeing me and every other country that belongs to this organization coming at you. Okay, right now there's definitely a lot of kind of question about NATO. Currently, the United States, the Trump administration, kind of not big fans of NATO, and some of the actions that have been going on here lately with Greenland have put us at odds with a lot of our NATO allies, and so we'll have to see if NATO continues on into the future. They have played a role, kind of like with the UN, of creating a very a more peaceful world than not since World War II ended. We have not seen a World War III, and some people credit NATO to that it has created enough of a counterbalance that countries like the Soviet Union and now Russia and China, they respect that, and they don't want to mess with that. And so if NATO is starting to enter into a phase now where it's either going to dissolve or weaken, creates some interesting questions about where things go in the future. But not questions we're going to get figured out here. All right. Another example of supranationalism, the European Union, which we've mentioned already, established in 1993, and 27 countries belong, and countries that belong to the European Union have all kinds of political connections. We talked about the EU having basically open borders with each other. They have a ton of economic connections between each other, a lot of trade that goes on between them, and they act together. That's kind of the part of the idea of the European Union is, yeah, individual countries in there have the freedom to do their own thing, but they also sacrifice some things to belong to the European Union. Notice with a lot of these organizations, you do give up a little bit of, in a way, a little bit of your sovereignty. To belong. If I just talked about NATO there, if you belong to NATO and one of the other countries in NATO gets in, some kind of an argument with another country that doesn't concern you, and it turns into a war, then you are bound by that treaty to help that other country out. And, if you said, no, I'm not going to do that, then what good is the treaty? Okay, and even countries that belong to the United Nations, they're expected to contribute money to the UN for projects like dealing with famines and disasters, dealing with refugee situations. So everyone gives something up to belong to these organizations. Though just the hope is that what you get out of it balances that out, or maybe you get more out of it, by the investment you put into it. All right. And let's see, the last example I'll give you here, supranationalism, is what used to be called NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. Now it is the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. And that is strictly economic. It is a trade agreement between our three countries here in North America, and tries to create some rules so that the trade between our countries is fair. We've had a lot of kind of tariff talk here in the last year that has kind of complicated that. But those are three countries that understand they all have something to gain by allowing the easiest access in terms of trade between the three. So that is also what we could call economic supranationalism at that point. Okay, there you go. All right. And then, like I talked about, kind of the what do you get out of it, and what do you give up from it? So if we're talking about things like the UN, especially NATO, you have that defense element of it. You have the fact that if you get into any kind of trouble, you've got friends. And when it comes to warfare, things like that, hey, you need as many allies as you can to have your back. You don't want to be entering into conflicts on your own. When we went to war, and I'll use that word war against Afghanistan. After 9/11, we found out that they were giving safe haven to Al Qaeda, the terrorist organization that carried out the 9/11 terror attacks, and because we were attacked that day, right? 9/11, that was an attack on the United States by a terror organization. NATO came to our aid, and when we went into Afghanistan, we didn't go in alone. A ton of our NATO allies either provided technical support. Many of them sent soldiers into Afghanistan as well. We had all kinds of help from other countries because it was a NATO operation. It just wasn't the USA versus Afghanistan. Okay, so that's where you get that defense part. And then, yes, when we look at those elements of the European Union and the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the hope, the goal is that there is going to be, a better economic conditions when countries are working cooperatively with each other in terms of trade, instead of, again, threats of, we're going to charge, import taxes like, this or when you get into kind of like what they call trade wars. And a trade war is when countries can't agree. And, sometimes that's when you get the threats of tariffs, you get the threats of significant import taxes, which tariffs are kind of the same thing. That's flying in the opposite direction. If we're looking at supranationalism working effectively, that benefit is some prosperity. Okay. But like I said, there's costs that come with all of it. And I mentioned some of the others there up above. And with number 4, it just talks about, all of these organizations have rules. Okay, what you have to do, what you don't have to do, um, and you have to agree to those if you're going to be a member of those. And if you can't, you don't join, or you end up not being in there anymore. Well, Britain is a perfect example of a country that thought that a lot of the rules of the European Union were not fair to them, and that they were having to give up too much of their economic sovereignty. And so, very, very famously, in 2016, they exited the European Union, what came to be known as Brexit. Britain exits the European Union, and they had been on the euro, which is the currency, the common currency of the European Union. The British are now back to their pound, and yeah, it's just that kind of thing happens sometimes. All right. All right, moving it on. Okay, now we'll focus in on specifically. I'm giving you some examples of some things that kind of double up and kind of get in there as well. And USMCA, that U.S. Mexico Canada agreement, would definitely be that. But we'll look at some others here. Okay, probably the biggest supranational organization in the world when it comes to economics is the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and the job of the WTO is pretty much the idea of trying to maintain a system of fair trade worldwide. So kind of like setting the rules for trade. Okay, so things being shipped from country to country, goods that are being imported and exported. They're kind of a controversial organization because a lot of people still say that the big, powerful, very richest countries like the United States and China, that they get a lot more their way with an organization like the WTO, and smaller countries kind of get trampled and told what to do. Where the bigger countries kind of get to set the agenda and say, yeah, hey, that's the way it's going to be. So there is a little bit of that pushback on an organization like the World Trade Organization. OPEC is the next one, and Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And this is 13 countries, mostly of the Middle East, not exclusively, but they are the ones who control oil trade. And when we talk about how much we're paying for a gallon of gas at the tank, at the pump, or whether we're talking about home heating oil and things like that, OPEC has influence over that. Here in the United States, we produce a lot of our own oil now. We have our own oil resources, but we kind of like top that off with oil that we buy on the world market. And OPEC works together to pretty much set prices. The countries that belong to it agree that they'll keep their prices all in about the same line, whatever they're charging for a barrel of oil, and that no one's going to go rogue and try to undersell everyone else. And that way it stabilizes the world oil market for good and for bad. When sometimes they see the trade values and people, supply and demand is kind of getting out of whack, and suddenly the price of oil is starting to go down because there's not as much demand for it. They agree to stop producing as much. And pretty soon, boom, you're adjusting and the price of oil is going back up because there's not as much of it available. And so they kind of play that kind of a game. And, some people sometimes accuse it's kind of, manipulating the market to enrich themselves. And there's something to be said for that. When you have a product that others want and you have it, you sometimes have the power to do those kinds of things. All right. All right, from supranationalism to transnational corporations. Okay, you got your definition there. And so these are your big international companies, right? They may operate in one country, kind of home base, but then they have offices and storefronts or product all over the world. And these are companies usually that have grown so large that it talks about less national identity, that maybe in the early days they were very tightly connected to the country that they came from. But as time goes on, as they get bigger and bigger and bigger, they never completely lose it. But there's not as much of that straight up association with where that company first got its beginnings. Okay, with these transnational corporations, we're talking what they operate on is what we call economies of scale. And so, these are companies that, part of the reason they get so big is because the bigger they get, the cheaper they can produce whatever their thing is that they make. And that size gives them the ability to produce things at a huge scale. And the more they make, typically the rule goes that the less expensive it's going to be. Okay, when you're producing at scale. I'm not going to go into massive detail on this, but both when we talk about those transnational corporations and we break it down into that concept of economies of scale, they use both horizontal and vertical integration to get this done. And horizontal that you see pictured there kind of gets into the idea of someone kind of gets in. I don't know. You think of it like Amazon, and really there's bits and pieces with both of this. But because I could make the argument like with Amazon, in the early days of Amazon, you'd order stuff off Amazon and then it would be delivered either through the mail, or some of it might come through FedEx or UPS. But as many of nowadays you order from Amazon, and most likely it's going to be an Amazon truck or at least an Amazon driver who is bringing it to you. Amazon reached a point where they said, you know what, we can make more money. We can do this more cheaply if we just buy our own our own vehicles, and we hire our own delivery people, keep it all in-house and take that approach to it. And so that would be an example of vertical integration, right? Horizontal would be the fact that in the early days, Amazon sold stuff from a whole lot of different businesses, but didn't take long before Amazon started to produce its own things. And, Amazon brand, whether it's clothing, whether it's sporting equipment, whether it's almost anything you can think of, there's now an Amazon branded version of it. And that kind of gets into that idea of horizontal integration. Okay. Again, those aren't terms that we have to get like super duper nitty gritty on, but just to understand that those both tie in when we talk about these economies of scale that we see transnational corporations make use of. All right. Downsides to economic supranationalism is something I think we have talked about in here before, and that is that maybe we haven't. I think about it. Maybe this is our first introduction, but what we call the outsourcing of jobs. Okay, we've got a lot of empty factories in the United States. Buildings that are just kind of abandoned, and you go back 75, maybe 100 years ago. Those things were full of Americans working in those factories and making things. But over time, a lot of those businesses realized, we got to pay those Americans, $10 an hour, $15 an hour, whatever it might be. But if we move our production to a country that is not as economically powerful as the United States, we only have to pay those employees $2 an hour. And so the difference between that $10, $15 an hour we're paying an American, the $2 we pay to this, this person working out of the country, that difference in between is pure profit for the company. All right. And so that's a lot of times where you see that outsourcing of jobs, is that it's to produce more profit for the company itself. And so, that doesn't help the home country, like I said, if I'm going back to America, because there's fewer jobs available for Americans. There are a lot of times there are American-based companies, but they are moving their jobs to other countries, and that's that idea of outsourcing, okay, or sometimes just referred to as moving your business your business overseas, okay. Um, Downsides that you have there at the end there, okay. Yeah, we get stuff cheaper, that's for sure, all right, and we're used to, especially, like they call fast fashion, things that are in style right now, and we expect to be able to buy them fairly inexpensively, clothing, stuff like that. But on the flip side, where the work is being done in these other countries, again, a lot of times people are being paid very little. uh, it definitely makes life a challenge for them. Some of them, we know, sometimes that work is being done by children. Child labor is a huge problem in some developing countries or less developed countries, and it's sometimes difficult for companies over here to be able to control that. One of the companies that's been accused of that more than many others is Nike, and Nike, they claim that that they try to police the work being done in their factories in Asia. But stories keep coming back that sometimes there are kids as young as 7, 8 years old that are working in those factories, so that we can get our shoes cheap. So there's that sort of thing. And then sometimes there are quality issues as well, because people are being paid well, or just aren't very well trained in what they do, because the main idea is we just want cheap labor. Sometimes that does result in the products that we're dealing with, clothing that falls apart, appliances that don't last very long, that kind of thing. All right. And then environmental supranationalism. Let's see, with that one, let's go with this. And that is just this idea, like I just mentioned, okay? Nike is based in Beaverton, down, just about, I guess 20, 25 miles from us here at Seton, down outside of Portland. That is where their fancy, beautiful campus is. If you ever get a chance, go check it out. It's a pretty amazing. The Adidas, it's not their main headquarters, but Adidas also has a headquarters in Portland proper. But the Beaverton Nike campus is pretty amazing. And so that's usually how these work. Okay, when we talk about supranationalism, is these corporations are going to have their headquarters in a developed country, all right, a country that usually has the wealth. And then the manufacturing that they have done, that's where they head off to the less developed or the developing world. And again, it's cheaper to work there, and that makes more profit for the companies. Okay, but the flip side of all of that, on top of again, child labor and work conditions, things like that, is that another reason sometimes why these developing or less developed countries are chosen is because they don't have many environmental rules or regulations. There's not rules about limits on how much pollution factories can be producing and things like that. And so that also is a flip, kind of a downside that we definitely see coming out of all of this. All right. And but the upside is that's all we're going to cover with these notes. All right, 28 minutes. It's long enough, but hey, not as long as last time. That will leave us with kind of the home stretch that we will cover together, and we will do that when we are back together. All right. Thank you, and we'll see you soon.